There are skills you carry quietly for decades, tucked away like a knife in a drawer sharp, waiting, and never once mentioned unless absolutely necessary. My Korean was one of those skills. 22 years in the Army, 14 of them working intelligence in and around the Korean peninsula, will do that to a man. I came home fluent, and I stayed that way reading novels, watching dramas with my late wife Eleanor, keeping the language alive like a garden I tended in private. My son had no idea. My neighbors had no idea. And the young woman who would soon sit at my dinner table, smiling sweetly at me in English, while whispering poison in Korean to her friend, she certainly had no idea. But I did, and I want to tell you exactly what I heard, what I did, and why I waited as long as I did before I finally said enough. My name is Gerald. I'm 64 years old. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, in the same house where I raised my son, Daniel, after Eleanor passed. The house is modest, 3 bedrooms, a wide front porch, a backyard that backs up to a tree line. Eleanor had planted roses along the fence. I keep them trimmed every spring because it feels like the right thing to do. Daniel grew up here. He mowed that yard, scraped his knees on that driveway, and eventually grew into a man I was genuinely proud of. He works in software development now, smart as a whip, careful with money, gentle-hearted in ways that sometimes worried me because gentle-hearted people can be taken advantage of, and the world is not always gentle in return. He was 31 when he brought her home. Her name was Yuna. She was Korean-American, born in Seoul, raised in Los Angeles from the age of 8. She spoke English without any accent at all, confident and smooth, the kind of English that comes from years of deliberate practice. She was beautiful, I won't pretend otherwise, with sharp eyes and a smile that appeared and disappeared so quickly you sometimes wondered if you'd imagined it. Daniel was clearly smitten. He'd been talking about her for 3 months before I finally met her, and when he introduced her at Thanksgiving, she shook my hand with both of hers and said, "I've heard so much about you, Mr. Gerald. Daniel talks about you constantly." I said something polite. I smiled. But something in my chest didn't settle the way it should have when you meet someone your child loves. My old sergeant used to call it the quiet alarm. Not a loud feeling, not panic, just a low hum, like a refrigerator you notice only when it stops. Something is running that shouldn't be, or something has stopped that should be going. I'd learned to trust that alarm in places where ignoring it could get people killed. I saw it fire up when I met Yuna, and I didn't dismiss it. I noted it, the way you note the weather before a long drive, and I kept watching. The first dinner went fine on the surface. Yuna helped clear the table. She complimented Eleanor's old china, which I still use for guests. She asked me about my career. I told her the broad strokes, as I always do, nothing classified, just enough to answer the question. She nodded attentively. Daniel watched her the way young men in love watch the person they love, like she was a solution to a problem he hadn't known he had. She pulled out her phone once during dinner, briefly, and typed something. I didn't think much of it at the time. About 2 weeks later, Daniel called to tell me he and Yuna were getting serious. He used the word future. He asked if I'd be comfortable with another dinner, something more relaxed, just the 3 of us at my house. I said of course. I meant it. The night before that second dinner, I was at the hardware store in town when I ran into a man I hadn't seen in almost 8 years. His name is Jimmy Park, Master Sergeant James Park, retired, my counterpart on a joint intelligence team back in 2003. Jimmy is Korean-American, 61, now lives in Maryville and runs an auto repair shop. We'd stayed loosely in touch over the years, the way veterans do Christmas cards, the occasional text when something in the news reminded one of us of the other. We stood in the cleaning supplies aisle for 40 minutes just talking. His wife had just recovered from knee surgery. His youngest had gotten into Vanderbilt. Good news all around. Before we parted, I told him about Yuna, just in passing. The way you mentioned something that's sitting lightly on your mind. I described her, mentioned she was Korean-American, from Los Angeles. Jimmy went a little still. He asked me her last name. I told him, Park. No relation to him, presumably. He asked her approximate age, and I said mid-20s, maybe 26 or 27. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That's probably nothing, just a common name." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He told me to enjoy my dinner. He said to call him sometime. I drove home with that refrigerator hum getting a little louder. The second dinner was on a Saturday. I made pot roast Eleanor's recipe, the one that takes 6 hours and fills the whole house. Daniel arrived first, helped me set the table, talked about a project at work. He seemed happy in a way that made me careful, the kind of happy that's also vulnerable, the kind that can break clean if something hits it wrong. Yuna arrived 20 minutes later with a bottle of wine and a friend she'd mentioned in passing, a Korean woman named Hae-won, who was visiting from Los Angeles for the weekend. She introduced her quickly, almost as an afterthought, and Hae-won smiled at me and said, "Nice to meet you," and sat down at the far end of the table. I welcomed her. Of course I did. I don't have a rude bone in my body, or at least I work hard at it. We ate. The pot roast was good. Daniel ate 2 helpings and looked embarrassed when I pointed it out. Yuna tasted hers slowly, said it was wonderful, and set down her fork in a way that told me she was done. Hae-won ate quietly and looked around the room with what I can only describe as professional assessment, not like a guest admiring someone's home, more like someone taking inventory. Then Yuna said something to Hae-won in Korean. She said it quietly, leaning slightly sideways, the way people do when they don't want to be rude, but can't help themselves. She said, "그 사람 완전 시골뜨기야. 저 장식들 좀 봐. 불쌍해." Which translates plainly to, "He's such a country bumpkin. Look at those decorations. Pathetic." She was referring to the photographs on my mantel. Eleanor's photographs. Our wedding photo. Daniel's Little League picture. A framed watercolor a student gave me years ago when I taught an adult continuing education class. I did not react. I reached for the bread and asked Daniel how the Vanderbilt game had gone last weekend. Hae-won responded to Yuna quietly in Korean. 걔 아들은 왜 이런 데서 자랐어? 돈도 없어 보이는데. Why did her boyfriend grow up in a place like this? Doesn't look like they have money. Yuna smiled and said, in Korean, 괜찮아. 아들이 잘 보니까. It's fine. The son earns well. I picked up my wine glass and took a sip and said to Daniel, "You should bring her to the state park sometime. The trail along the ridge is something else in October." Daniel said he'd love that. Yuna turned to me with her full smile and said, "That sounds amazing, Mr. Gerald. I love hiking." I smiled back. "I thought you might," I said. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't rage, not yet. What I felt was something colder and more useful than rage. It was clarity. The quiet alarm had resolved into a clean signal, and the signal said, "This woman does not love your son. This woman is calculating your son. There is a difference, and you know it, and now you have heard it with your own ears, in a language she does not know you understand." The dinner ended pleasantly. I sent them home with leftover pot roast. I hugged my son at the door and told him to drive safe. Yuna shook my hand again with both of hers and said it had been a wonderful evening. Hae-won nodded politely and followed her to the car. I stood on my porch and watched their taillights disappear down the road. Then I went inside and called Jimmy Park. I told him exactly what had been said at my table. I told him in Korean, because it felt right to use the language that had delivered the information. Jimmy listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Gerald, I need to tell you something I probably should have told you at the hardware store." He told me that 3 years ago, he'd heard through mutual contacts other Korean Americans in the veterans community, people with connections to various agencies, about a small pattern of cases in the Southeast. Young Korean women, presentable and educated, targeting American men in certain income brackets. Not the very wealthy that draws too much scrutiny, the comfortable bracket, software engineers, mid-level managers, men with steady savings and generous hearts. The scheme varied case by case, but the through line involved financial entanglement, joint accounts, co-signed loans, transfers made in the early months of a committed relationship before the man understood what was happening. Jimmy said he didn't know if Yuna was connected to any of that. He said the name and description were similar to someone his contact had mentioned, but he couldn't be certain. He said, "But you've got ears, Gerald. Use them." I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in Eleanor's chair by the window and thought about Daniel, about his gentleness, his trust, the way he'd looked at Yuna over the dinner table. I thought about what it would do to him if I was wrong, and I thought about what it would do to him if I was right and said nothing. By morning, I had decided I would listen. I would be patient. I would not accuse, Not yet, because accusation without evidence is just noise, and noise gets ignored. What I needed was signal. Over the next 6 weeks, I became very attentive. I called Daniel every few days, as I always had, and I listened for changes in his language, in his concerns, in the small financial details that come up naturally in conversation. He mentioned, in week 3, that Una had suggested they open a shared savings account. Just a small one, he said, for trips and things. He laughed about it, said it was a big step. I said, "That's something to think carefully about, son." He said, "Dad, you worry too much." Maybe. But the refrigerator hum was now a full-frequency signal. I also began to pay closer attention to what Una said in Korean when she was around me, which was more often now, as Daniel had taken to bringing her along on Sunday dinners that had become something of a habit. She apparently believed, firmly and completely, that I was a pleasant but intellectually limited old man from Tennessee who had spent his career in logistics, which is what Daniel had told her based on what I'd told Daniel, which was the simplified version I gave everyone who didn't have clearance. She spoke freely. Over 6 weeks, I heard her tell Hey-One on a phone call. Hey-One called often, and Una would sometimes take the call in my kitchen while I was just around the corner in the living room that Daniel was almost ready for a conversation about finances. I heard her describe my house as an asset Daniel would eventually inherit, worth more than it looked because of the land. I heard her say, once, in a tone that was almost bored, "이 남자는 너무 착해서 문제야." The problem with this man is he's too kind. She meant Daniel. She was not wrong. And she was counting on it. In week 5, I made a phone call of my own, not to Jimmy this time, but to a woman named Sheila Dawson, who had been a financial crimes investigator with the FBI field office in Knoxville before she retired 4 years ago. Sheila and I had crossed paths years back during a case that overlapped between military intelligence and federal jurisdiction, and we'd stayed in occasional contact. I explained the situation carefully, what I'd heard, what Jimmy had told me, the timeline of the relationship and its escalating financial hints. Sheila listened. Then she said, "Gerald, I'm retired, but I have a very good friend who isn't." Within a week, she called me back with a name and a number at the Knoxville field office. She told me, quietly, that the pattern I'd described matched an open investigation, not closed, not speculative, open, and that my information, if documented, could be materially useful. I documented everything. Dates, times, direct quotes in Korean with my own English translation below each one. I printed it out and drove it to a coffee shop near the university, where a young agent named Marcus Webb met me, and accepted the folder without much ceremony, which told me this was not new information so much as confirming information. He said, "Mr. Gerald, we'd like to ask you to do something that might be uncomfortable." I said, "Son, I've done uncomfortable things for this country in places you've never heard of. Tell me what you need." He told me they wanted one more dinner. I said I'd make the pot roast again. I told Daniel I wanted to do a proper family dinner, nothing special, just the 3 of us. Maybe with Hey-One again if she was in town, since she seemed to get along well with Una, and I wanted everyone to feel relaxed. Daniel seemed touched that I was making the effort. He said he'd ask Una. Una apparently said yes immediately. Hey-One was not in town. That was fine. The important audience was Daniel. I cooked all day. I was calm in a way I hadn't expected, not the calm of a man who has suppressed his feelings, but the calm of a man who has done his homework, made his decision, and accepted whatever comes next. I thought about Eleanor while I cooked. She had always said I was too slow to anger and too patient for my own good. I thought she might revise that opinion slightly if she could see the evening that was coming. They arrived at 6. Daniel brought flowers. He does that sometimes, quietly, when he senses something important is happening without knowing why. He set them in the vase on the counter without being asked because he remembered where his mother always kept the vase. Una set her purse on the chair and immediately offered to help, moving through my kitchen with the ease of someone who had decided it was already partly hers. We sat down to eat around 6:30. The conversation was easy. Una was charming, I'll give her that. She asked about my health, about the garden, about a book she'd noticed on my side table last time. She had done her research on me. Such as it was, she knew what a pleasant, harmless old man in Tennessee was supposed to care about. And she reflected it back carefully. I watched her work and thought, in another life, in different circumstances, this could have been skill put towards something worthwhile. About 40 minutes in, She set down her fork and looked at Daniel with the particular expression of someone who has rehearsed a moment. She said, "Daniel, I wanted to talk to you both tonight about something I've been thinking about." She smiled at me inclusively, as though I were a beloved prop in a scene. "I know it might seem fast, but I've been looking at some financial options for Daniel and me going forward. There's a property in Nashville I think could be a real opportunity." Daniel looked surprised but not alarmed. He started to say something. I set down my own fork. I looked at Yuna. She looked back at me with her careful smile. And I said in Korean, slowly and clearly, "좀 오래된 돼지처럼 보일 수도 있겠지만 당신이 처음 이 집에 왔을 때부터 모든 말을 다 알아들었습니다." Which means, I may look like a worn-out old pig, but I have understood every single word you've said since the first night you walked into this house. The smile didn't vanish slowly. It was there, and then it was gone, like a light switched off. What replaced it was not anger or defiance. It was the particular blankness of someone whose internal calculations have all just returned an error at the same moment. Her hand, which had been resting lightly on the table, went still. Daniel said, "Dad, what?" I kept my eyes on Yuna. I continued in Korean, still calm. "나슈빌 부동산 이야기도 들었어요. 공동 계좌 이야기도요. 회원이랑 통화하는 것도 들었고요. I heard about the Nashville property. I heard about the joint account. I heard your calls with Hey-One." She pushed her chair back slightly. Daniel said, "Louder now, Dad. What is happening?" I switched to English. I looked at my son and I spoke carefully, because this was the part I had thought about the most. Not what I would say to Yuna, but what I would say to Daniel. How to tell him without crushing him. How to hand him the truth with both hands, gently enough that he could hold it. "Son," I said, "I need you to listen to me and trust me for the next few minutes. I know this is hard, but there are things I've been hearing at this table for the past 2 months that I documented and shared with federal investigators, because what was being planned involved you and your finances in a way that needed to be stopped." Daniel stared at me. He looked at Yuna. He looked back at me. Yuna stood up. She didn't run. She was too composed for that, even now. She reached for her purse with a steadiness I had to respect on a professional level, even as I was the one who had dismantled everything she'd built. She said in English, very quietly, "You don't know what you're talking about," I said. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, and so do the people waiting outside. I don't want to dramatize what happened next because it was, honestly, very undramatic. Marcus Webb and his colleague had been in a car at the end of the street. They knocked on my door less than 2 minutes later. They were professional and quiet about it. Yuna said nothing more. She was walked outside and into a car and driven away, and the whole thing took about 7 minutes. Daniel sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that. I sat with him. I didn't rush him or try to fill the silence with words he wasn't ready to hear. I put on coffee because it was something to do with my hands, and because Daniel has been a coffee drinker since college. He asked me, eventually, how long I had known. I told him the truth. I had heard things at the very first dinner that made me uneasy. I had known with certainty about 6 weeks ago. I had spent those 6 weeks making sure I was right before I said a word to anyone, because I understood what it would cost him to hear it, and I refused to say it unless I was certain. He said, "Why didn't you just tell me?" I had thought about how to answer this too. I said, "Because you loved her, or you loved who you believed she was. And I've learned your mother taught me this, that you can't argue someone out of love with logic. You can only give them the truth and trust them to come through it." He was quiet again. Then he said, "She always seemed a little too interested in what I earned." I said, "Your instincts were probably working fine. Sometimes we just need a little time to trust them." He looked at his coffee. "You speak Korean?" "Fluently," I said. "Have for 40 years. He let out a sound that was half laugh, half something more complicated. "You never told me. You never asked," I said, "and it never came up." He shook his head slowly. Then he said, in a quiet voice that had more steadiness in it than I'd expected, "I'm glad you were paying attention, Dad." We sat there until the coffee was gone. I thought about Jimmy Park, who had trusted a hunch at a hardware store and made a phone call that set everything in motion. I thought about Sheila Dawson, retired but never fully away from the work, who had given me a bridge to the right people at the right time. I thought about the way communities of quiet, experienced people look out for one another and for the people they love, not loudly, not with ceremony, but steadily, like a light left on in a window. And I thought about Eleanor, who had once told me years ago, during a disagreement I can't even fully recall now, that patience is not the same as passivity. Patience is what you practice while you're doing the work. Passivity is what you call it when you were afraid to act. She had a way of saying true things simply, without fanfare, and then walking away and letting them settle. They settled, Eleanor. Finally and fully, they settled. I want to say one more thing, because I think it matters. I know some of you watching this have had that quiet alarm go off in a relationship, in a family situation, in a friendship that began to feel more extractive than mutual. And I know how easy it is to tell yourself you're overreacting, that you're being unfair, that you should give the person more time or more benefit of the doubt. I know that voice. I've listened to it. And I've learned, at 64 years old and after more than a few hard lessons, that the alarm doesn't mean the person is guilty. It means pay attention, gather information, be patient, be methodical. Don't act until you're certain, but don't ignore the signal just because you can't yet explain it. Your instincts are not always right, but they are almost never random. The difference between wisdom and impulse is not speed, it's evidence. Act on impulse and you may be wrong and cause harm. Act on evidence and you have done everything a person can do. Daniel is doing well. He took some time off work, spent a few weeks in Knoxville, and we did, eventually, hike that trail along the ridge. The October color was extraordinary. He didn't talk much on the way up, but on the way back down, he said, out of nowhere, "I think I need to slow down. Stop rushing towards something just because it looks like what I want." I said, "That sounds like wisdom, son." He said, "Where'd I get that from?" I said, "Your mother." He laughed a real laugh, uncomplicated, and we walked the rest of the way down in good silence. Eleanor's roses came in beautifully this spring. I trimmed them last week, early in the morning, before the heat came on. I thought about her while I worked, as I always do. And I thought that the best thing you can give the people you love is not protection from all difficulty. You cannot give that, and you would diminish them if you tried. The best thing you can give them is your full attention, your accumulated knowledge, and the willingness to act when acting is what love requires. Everything else, with patience and time, tends to take care of itself. If this story reached you at a moment when you needed to hear it, trust that feeling. You're here for a reason. And if you've ever had a moment when staying quiet, staying watchful, and trusting yourself made all the difference, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Where you're watching from, what it brought up for you. This community has surprised me again and again with how much quiet wisdom lives in it. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.